Yes.
You didn't belong here.
The silence in room 304 was not merely the absence of sound, but the presence of a suffocating, pressurized weight that tasted distinctively of graphite shavings and impending judgment. It was the first Monday of the month, the day Mr. Sterling revealed the class rankings for AP Physics C, a ritual he performed with the theatrical cruelty of a man who believed intellectual hierarchy was the only true religion. I sat in the third row, second seat from the window, a strategic position I had calculated to maximize natural light while minimizing the glare on the whiteboard, yet today the sunlight felt cold against my neck. The air conditioner hummed a low, monotonous drone that seemed to vibrate in the hollow of my chest, sinking with a heartbeat I forced to remain steady. Dust motes danced in the singular beam of light cutting across the room, suspended in the stillness like the 50 other students who held their breath, their eyes fixed forward, terrified that a wayward glance might attract the predator's attention. Mr. Sterling did not walk, he patrolled. His leather loafers clicked against the linoleum floor with a metronomic precision that signaled his approach long before his shadow fell over a student's desk. He was a man composed of sharp angles and tweed, smelling of stale coffee and the old paper of textbooks that hadn't been updated since the Cold War. He prided himself on being the gatekeeper of the institution's prestige, a sentinel standing guard against what he considered the dilution of academic rigor. As he moved down the aisle, the clicking stopped. The silence deepened, stretching tight like a rubber band ready to snap. He was standing right beside me. I did not look up immediately. I kept my eyes focused on the grain of the wooden desk, tracing the scratches left by decades of nervous students before me, counting the imperfections to anchor myself in the physical world. I could feel his gaze, a physical weight pressing down on the crown of my head, analyzing, dissecting, and finding wanting. He cleared his throat, a wet, dismissive sound. When I finally raised my head, his expression was not one of anger, which would have been easier to handle, but one of pity. It was a soft, patronizing look that stung worse than any shout. He placed a hand on the corner of my desk, leaning in close enough that I could see the broken capillaries in his nose, invading my personal space with the casual entitlement of someone who believed he owned every square inch of the room. "David," he said, his voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper that was somehow loud enough to carry to the back of the room. "I have been looking over the preliminary trajectories for this semester." He paused, letting the words hang there, ensuring the entire class was listening to what was ostensibly a private consultation. "We have to be realistic about our aptitudes. This is AP Physics. It is not for everyone, and there is no shame in finding a pace that is more suitable for your background." The phrase hung in the air, "for your background." It was a masterpiece of plausible deniability, a coded message that everyone in the room understood, but no one could technically accuse him of saying. He wasn't talking about my previous grades, which were perfect. He wasn't talking about my grasp of calculus, which exceeded his own. He was talking about the neighborhood on my file, the scholarship that paid my tuition, and the color of my skin that stood out in the sea of beige faces surrounding me. He was telling me I was a guest here, and that my welcome had expired. I felt the heat rise in my cheeks, not from shame, but from a burning, righteous indignation that I had learned to smother behind a mask of stoic indifference. To react was to lose. To speak was to confirm his bias that I was emotional, volatile, unsuited for the cold logic of science. So I did the only thing I could do. I stared right back at him, my face a blank canvas, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing me flinch. I did not blink. I did not apologize. I simply held his gaze until the pity in his eyes flickered into something resembling discomfort. He pulled back, straightening his jacket, evidently disappointed that I hadn't crumbled or thanked him for his benevolent racism. "Very well," he muttered, turning his back to me to march toward the front of the room. "But do not say I did not warn you when the reality sets in." He reached the smartboard at the front of the class, the digital glow illuminating his silhouette like a minor deity. The projector hummed to life, casting a blue square against the whiteboard. This was the moment. The ranking list. It was a public display of every student's cumulative score, organized from highest to lowest, a barbaric tradition intended to shame the weak and glorify the strong. My classmates shifted in their seats, a collective rustle of anxiety. I could feel their eyes darting toward me, wondering how hard the fall would be, wondering if Mr. Sterling was right. The screen flickered. The spreadsheet loaded. And as the names populated the screen in bold black text, the room went from silent to absolutely dead. The name at the very top of the list, sitting alone in the 99th percentile, was not the captain of the debate team, nor the son of the school board president. The letters were large, undeniable, and sharp. The projector's cooling fan hummed with a mechanical persistence, the only sound daring to intrude upon a silence so profound it felt heavy enough to bruise the air. Dust motes danced in the cone of blue light that threw the spreadsheet against the whiteboard, illuminating the undeniable mathematics of my existence in that room. I did not smile. To smile would have been to admit that this was a surprise, or worse, a miracle. A smile would have suggested that I was relieved to find myself at the top, whereas my actual internal state was one of cold, calculated affirmation. I watched Mr. Sterling's face from the safety of my desk. He did not look angry. Anger implies passion, and Mr. Sterling was a man of cold rigidity. Instead, he looked as if he were trying to solve a complex equation that had suddenly yielded an impossible variable. He blinked, once, twice, his eyes darting from the screen to his own ledger on the desk, searching for the clerical error that must surely exist. But there was no error. There was only the data. And the data said that the boy he had dismissed as a cultural tourist, a diversity hire in the grand architecture of the academy, had not just passed but had set a standard that his preferred students could not reach. This moment, however, was not the triumph of a sports movie underdog. It was something far more corrosive and exhausting. This is what we call the black tax, though in that silent classroom, it felt less like a tax and more like a ransom I had just paid to keep my own dignity alive. The black tax is often discussed in economic terms, the money successful professionals send home to support extended family, but there is a psychological bracket to this tax that is rarely audited. It is the cognitive tariff levied on every action, every assignment, and every interaction. It is the requirement to be twice as good to get half the credit, a cliché that has been repeated so often it has lost its edge, yet it remains the fundamental law of physics in spaces like this. For my classmates, a B- was a bad week, a stumble to be laughed off over lunch. For me, a B- would have been a confirmation of genetic inferiority in the eyes of the man holding the gradebook. They were allowed to have potential, I was only allowed to have proof. If I slipped, I didn't just fail myself, I failed an entire demographic. I confirmed the silent hypothesis hanging in the air like humidity, that I was here by charity, not by right. I looked around the room, seeing the shift in posture among my peers. The hostility had evaporated, replaced by a confused recalibration. They were rewriting their internal narratives about me in real time. I wasn't the outsider anymore, I was the threat. And that transition is dangerous. It requires a specific kind of armor. As I sat there, anchoring myself against the back of the hard plastic chair, I realized that surviving this class had nothing to do with the subject matter. The history dates and calculus formulas were just the terrain. The actual war was fought on a psychological front. I had arrived at this moment not by accident, but by adhering to a strict, invisible curriculum passed down to me by my father, a man who had navigated corporate boardrooms with the same careful paranoia I now applied to 11th grade. He had taught me that in an environment designed for your exclusion, excellence is not enough. Excellence is just the baseline entry fee. To win, you need a strategy that dismantles their assumptions without triggering their defenses. My father had drilled 3 specific lessons into me, an open loop of survival tactics that I had been running in the background of my mind since the first day Mr. Sterling looked past me during roll call. These weren't lessons about how to be smart, they were lessons about how to be undeniable. First, he taught me the defense of excellence, how to weaponize perfectionism so that it becomes a shield no bias can penetrate. Second, he taught me the art of code switching, not just in language, but in behavior, learning to mirror the oppressor's values until they cannot distinguish you from themselves. And third, the most important lesson, was the accumulation of receipts, the physical evidence of competence that overrides opinion. As I watched Sterling finally turn away from the screen, his face settling into a mask of begrudging acceptance, I knew that the story wasn't over. This test score was just the first receipt. I had 3 more months in this class, 3 more months to execute the strategy my father had designed. I wasn't just here to learn, I was here to collect the debt they didn't know they owed. The library in our house was not a place of leisure but a fortification, a windowless room lined with mahogany shelves that smelled of cedar and the sharp, metallic scent of ink. It was here, under the yellow halo of a banker's lamp, that my father initiated me into the first pillar of survival, which he called the defense of excellence. He sat across from me, his hands folded over a leather-bound ledger, and explained that for a young black man in an institution built on his exclusion, mediocrity was not merely a failure of ambition but a threat to existence. He told me that the world allows others the luxury of a learning curve, the space to stumble and be corrected with grace, but for me, a mistake would never be interpreted as a simple error. It would be viewed as a confirmation of a stereotype, a genetic defect, a proof of my inherent unsuitability for the spaces I sought to occupy. Therefore, the only shield capable of repelling this assumption was a performance so flawless, so mathematically precise, that it left no surface area for their bias to latch onto. Excellence, in this context, was not about vanity or accolades. It was a form of aggressive self-preservation, a preemptive strike against the inevitable audit of my intelligence. I returned to the preparatory academy the next morning carrying this philosophy like a concealed weapon. The assignment Mr. Sterling had given us was a deceptively simple essay regarding the socio-economic causes of the Civil War, a topic he clearly believed was beyond the nuance of his students, particularly the one student he had already relegated to the bottom of his mental hierarchy. Most of the class treated the assignment as a hurdle to be cleared with minimal effort, relying on the sanitized summaries in the textbook. I, however, could not afford the luxury of the summary. I spent 3 nights in the university archives downtown, digging until my fingers were gray with dust, finding primary sources that contradicted the simplified narrative Sterling had fed us in his lectures. I wasn't just writing an essay, I was building a legal case. I needed to construct an argument so fortified with evidence and clarity that even if he hated the author, he would be forced to respect the text. This was the burden of the defense of excellence. I had to know the material better than the teacher did, not to humiliate him, but to ensure he could not humiliate me. When the day came to return our graded papers, the atmosphere in the classroom was heavy with the damp wool smell of uniforms and the nervous energy of adolescents awaiting judgment. Mr. Sterling walked the aisles with the slow, deliberate pace of a warden, dropping papers onto desks with varying degrees of force. When he reached my desk, he did not drop the paper. He held it for a moment, his thumb pressing into the corner of the stapled pages, creating a small crescent crease. He looked at me, and for the first time, his expression was not one of dismissal, but of confusion mixed with a subtle, simmering irritation. He placed the essay gently on the wood. There was no red ink. There were no corrections. There was only a grade at the top, circled in a perfect, reluctant blue loop, 98%. Below it, in handwriting that looked jagged and forced, he had written a single comment asking about a source I had cited from a localized economic journal in 1860. It was a question designed to test if I had actually read it or merely found the citation online. He cleared his throat and walked back to the front of the room, leaning against the chalkboard with a casual arrogance that I now recognized as a facade. He addressed the class, bringing up the obscure economic point from my essay, looking directly at me as he asked for clarification, a clear attempt to expose me as a fraud in real time. The room went silent. The other students turned, expecting me to falter, to stutter, to reveal that the excellence on the page was a ghost-written anomaly. But I was not afraid. The fear evaporates when you have done the work. I stood up, my legs steady, and I answered him. I didn't just answer the question, I expanded on it. I quoted the specific page number of the source. I referenced the counterarguments from the same journal issue. I spoke in complete, terrifyingly calm paragraphs, my voice projecting to the back of the room without shouting. I watched Mr. Sterling's face undergo a slow, painful transformation. He was looking for a crack in the armor, a mispronounced word, a hesitation, anything that would allow him to reinstate the natural order he believed in. But the defense of excellence is a wall without handholds. When I finished speaking and sat down, the silence in the room was different. It wasn't the silence of awkwardness, it was the silence of a paradigm shifting. I had not just passed a test. I had established a perimeter. He knew then, and I knew then, that he could not touch me, not because he didn't want to, but because I hadn't given him the permission of a single mistake. The library at St. Jude's Academy was a cathedral of silence, a cavernous room smelling of floor wax and decaying paper binding where the light filtered through high, arched windows to die on the carpet. I retreated there not to study, but to power down the engines that had been running at redline capacity since the confrontation in Mr. Sterling's classroom. Finding a table in the back corner, hidden behind the stacks of European history, I laid my hands on the cool laminate surface and tried to calibrate what I call the internal volume knob. If the defense of excellence is the shield, the internal volume knob is the camouflage, the precise auditory and energetic modulation required to exist in a space that was never designed for you. It is a piece of psychic machinery installed in the mind of every black student in a predominantly white institution, a mixing board where you must constantly adjust your treble, your bass, your warmth, and your sharpness to match the frequency of the room. Too much bass, too much force in your voice, and you become the aggressor, the threat, the disruptor of peace. Too much treble, too much eagerness to please, and you become the servant, the token, the safe commodity. The goal is to find the narrow, static-filled frequency in the middle where you are respected but not feared, present but not overwhelming. It is an exhausting, invisible labor that runs in the background like a battery-draining application on a smartphone. I was staring at a dust mote floating in a shaft of sunlight, listening to the hum of the HVAC system, when the silence was broken by the squeak of a sneaker on the tile. I didn't need to look up to know the dynamic had shifted. The air pressure always changes when a local enters the perimeter. It was Julian, a student whose father sat on the board of trustees, a boy who wore his entitlement like a loose-fitting varsity jacket. He pulled out the chair opposite me without asking, the legs scraping harsh against the floor, a sound that would have earned me a glare from the librarian but earned him nothing but continued silence. He dropped his bag. He leaned in. This was the moment the volume knob had to be adjusted. If I ignored him, I was being hostile. If I smiled too wide, I was being submissive. I mentally turned the dial. Eye contact at 70%, warmth at 40%, curiosity at 0. I waited. Julian wanted to talk about what happened with Sterling. He had heard the rumors. The hallway telegraph was efficient, though rarely accurate. He leaned his elbows on the table, invading my personal space with the casual confidence of someone who has never been hit. He told me that what I did was savage. He used that word specifically. Savage. It was meant as a compliment, a frat boy nod to dominance, but the word landed on the table like a dead bird. My internal sensors spiked. Here was the trap. If I accepted the compliment, I aligned myself with his definition of me as something wild, something untamed that had snapped. If I corrected him on his vocabulary, I became the sensitivity police, the humorless scold who couldn't take a joke. The volume knob required a micro-adjustment. I needed to intellectualize the moment, to strip it of emotion so that he could not feed on it. I looked him dead in the eye, keeping my face a mask of polite indifference. I spoke slowly, modulating my voice to a pitch that was soft but dense, like lead. I told him that it wasn't savage, nor was it a performance. I explained that it was merely an academic correction of a factual error, no different than solving for x in a calculus equation. I watched his face falter. He wanted a war story. He wanted me to recount the adrenaline, to bond with him over the rebellion against authority. He wanted to consume my struggle as entertainment. By denying him the emotional narrative, by turning the volume knob down to a dry, clinical monotone, I starved him of the drama he sought. He blinked, confused. The connection he tried to forge, one where he was the benevolent spectator and I was the gladiator, failed to materialize. I saw the disappointment register in his eyes, followed quickly by boredom. He didn't know how to interact with a version of me that wasn't performing for him. He mumbled something about Sterling being a jerk anyway, pushed his chair back, and wandered off toward the periodicals. I watched him go, and only then did I allow my shoulders to drop 3 inches. This is the tax. The tax is not just the racism itself, it is the energy required to constantly manage the comfort levels of the people around you. It is the necessity of being a diplomat in a war zone, of translating your humanity into a language they can understand without feeling threatened. The internal volume knob saves your life, but it costs you your spontaneity. You never just say something, you draft it, edit it, review it for tonal impact, and publish it, all in the span of a microsecond. I looked back at the dust mote in the sunlight. It was still floating there, aimless and free, subject only to the currents of the air. I envied it. It didn't have to decide how heavy to be. 2 days later, the smell of cedar shavings and stale pipe tobacco greeted me as I pushed open the heavy oak door to my grandfather's workshop, a sanctuary that existed entirely outside the suffocating timeline of the school week. It was Saturday, and the light here fell differently than it did in the fluorescent purgatory of the classroom, filtering through dust-moted beams that seemed to suspend time rather than count it down. My grandfather sat hunched over his workbench, the curvature of his spine suggesting a mountain that had weathered storms I could only imagine, his large, calloused hands manipulating the microscopic gears of an antique clock with the tenderness of a surgeon. I stood in the doorway for a long moment, allowing the silence of the room to settle into my bones, a silence that demanded nothing of me, a silence that did not ask me to edit my breathing or modulate my volume. Here, I did not have to be a diplomat in a war zone. I was simply a grandson standing in the presence of history. He did not look up when I entered, but the rhythm of his breathing shifted, a subtle acknowledgement of my presence that was louder than a shout. I walked over and sat on the 3-legged stool beside him, watching the dance of his fingers, the way he coaxed functionality out of broken things not with force, but with an understanding of how the mechanism was intended to work. He was the one who taught me that patience is a weapon, that rushing is an admission of fear, and today, I needed that weapon more than ever because the echo of Mr. Henderson's dismissal was still ringing in my ears like tinnitus. He placed a jeweler's loop in his eye and leaned closer to the brass mechanism, his voice rumbling from his chest like distant thunder, asking me without turning his head if the world had been heavy this week. I told him about the classroom. I told him about the way Mr. Henderson looked at me, not as a student to be taught, but as a stain to be removed. I told him about the feeling of being an imposter in a room I had earned the right to sit in. I expected him to be angry. I wanted him to be angry, to validate the fire in my belly with his own righteous indignation. But he did not rage. He carefully extracted a tiny spring with a pair of tweezers, inspected it against the light, and set it down on a velvet cloth with deliberate precision. Anger, he finally said, is a cheap fuel that burns dirty and clogs the engine. He turned to me then, removing the loop, his eyes holding a depth of clarity that was terrifying in its intensity. He told me that what I was experiencing was not a new phenomenon, but an inheritance. He spoke of the factories he worked in 50 years ago, where men with half his intelligence and none of his grace gave him orders he knew were wrong. He spoke of the times he was told he didn't belong in neighborhoods, in voting booths, in the front of the bus, in the very country his father had bled for. This was the counter-story he offered. The racism I faced was not a judgment on my ability, but a testament to my threat level. He explained that mediocrity is never persecuted because it is never feared, only potential is policed. The teacher didn't tell me I didn't belong because he thought I would fail. He said it because he was terrified I would succeed. This reframing shifted the gravity in the room. Suddenly, the burden wasn't on me to prove I was good enough. The burden was on the system to survive my excellence. My grandfather pointed a thick finger at the dismantled clock. He told me that the clock doesn't argue with the person reading the time. It just keeps the time, accurately, relentlessly, undeniably. If the mechanism is perfect, the result is irrefutable. That, he said, is the strategy. You do not argue with a man like Henderson. You do not plead for your humanity. You become the clock. You produce the work. You generate the receipts. The ranking list that was coming out wasn't just a grade sheet. It was the inevitable ticking of a mechanism that had been calibrated by generations of survival. He went back to the gears, the lesson delivered with the finality of a judge's gavel. I watched him work, feeling the tension in my shoulders dissolve, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. I wasn't just studying for a test anymore. I was preparing a dossier. I was the latest link in a chain of men who had learned to master the systems that were designed to break them. The black tax was heavy, yes, but I realized in that cedar-scented room that I came from a lineage of billionaires in the currency of resilience. I didn't need Mr. Henderson's permission to occupy space in that classroom. I had my grandfather's authorization, stamped in the endurance of his silence and the precision of his hands. I would take the test. I would post the score. I would let the numbers do the talking, because numbers, unlike people, do not have prejudices. They just have value. The fluorescent hum of the examination hall felt less like an annoyance and more like a steady, rhythmic bassline to the symphony of logic playing out in my head. It was the morning of the final assessment, the day Mr. Henderson had silently predicted would be my academic funeral, yet the air around my desk felt rarefied and clear. I remember the specific texture of the silence in that room. It was not empty. It was pressurized. 30 pencils scratched against paper like frantic insects, a collective sound of desperation and memory retrieval, but my own rhythm was deliberate. I was not rushing. I was building. Every equation I solved was a brick in a fortress that no bias could breach. Mr. Henderson paced the aisles with the slow, predatory gait of a warden inspecting a cell block, his shoes squeaking against the linoleum. I could feel the weight of his gaze every time he passed my row. He was waiting for the furrowed brow, the eraser rubbing through the paper, the telltale signs of a student drowning in complexity. He wanted to see the struggle because the struggle would validate his worldview that I was an interloper in his domain of high-level physics. But I refused to give him that performance. I kept my posture straight, my breathing regulated, and my eyes locked on the variables before me. This was the discipline my grandfather had spoken of, the ability to function at peak capacity while under the surveillance of those who wish for your failure. When I reached the final section of the exam, the synthesis problems that usually separated the capable from the gifted, I felt a strange sense of familiarity. These were not just math problems, they were systems, and I had spent my entire life navigating complex, unspoken systems. Solving for X was simple compared to solving for existence in a space that did not want you. I laid out the proofs with the elegance of a legal argument. There was a cold beauty in the numbers. They didn't care about my zip code. They didn't care about the hue of my skin or the history of the county. If the logic held, the answer was true. That was the sanctuary of the sciences. It was the one place where truth could not be gerrymandered by opinion. I turned the page, double-checked my calculations, and laid my pencil down. The click of the graphite hitting the wood of the desk was soft, but in the quiet room, it sounded like a judge bringing down a gavel. I looked up and caught Mr. Henderson's eye. He looked startled, checking the clock on the wall. I was finished 20 minutes early. I walked to the front of the room, placed my packet on the stack, and walked out. I didn't look back. The receipt had been printed, now I just had to wait for the transaction to clear. 3 days later, the ranking list appeared. It was an archaic tradition of the school, a single sheet of paper taped to the glass window of the physics lab, listing students by score, highest to lowest. It was a public shaming for some and a coronation for others. When I arrived at the corridor that morning, a knot of students had already formed around the glass. The air was thick with whispers and the rustle of backpacks. I didn't push my way to the front. I stood at the periphery, watching the backs of heads, listening to the murmurs ripple through the crowd. I saw heads turn, eyes scanning the hallway until they landed on me. The expressions were a mixture of confusion and awe. The crowd parted, not out of kindness, but out of a sudden, jarring respect. It was the Red Sea opening for a truth they hadn't anticipated. I walked to the glass. There it was. Row 1. The name was typed in the same font as everyone else's, but it seemed to vibrate on the page. My score was a 99. The next highest score was an 84. The gap was not just academic, it was astronomical. It was a chasm that swallowed every doubt Mr. Henderson had ever insinuated. I stood there, staring at the number. This was the receipt. This was the tangible, undeniable proof of purchase for my seat in that room. It wasn't an argument, or a plea for acceptance, or a protest. It was just a number. But that number carried the weight of generations. It was the receipt for the late nights, the extra readings, the swallowed pride, and the grandfather who polished boots so I could polish equations. Mr. Henderson was standing inside the lab, on the other side of the glass. He was organizing beakers, ostensibly busy, but I knew he was watching. I didn't smile. I didn't gesture. I simply looked at my score, then lifted my eyes to meet his through the pane. For a moment, we were suspended in a tableau of realization. His face was unreadable, perhaps a mix of embarrassment and cognitive dissonance, forcing his brain to rewrite the narrative he had constructed about me. He nodded, a microscopic, almost imperceptible dip of the chin. It wasn't an apology, men like him rarely apologize, but it was a concession. He broke eye contact first. He turned back to his equipment, defeated by the objective reality of the scoreboard. I turned away from the list and walked down the hall. The air felt lighter. I didn't need his validation anymore. I had the receipts, and in the currency of excellence, I was the richest man in the building. 10 years have passed since the rankings were posted on that bulletin board, and the silence of the school hallway feels different now that I am walking through it as a man rather than a boy. I returned to the campus this afternoon not as a student seeking validation, but as an invited alumnus, a guest speaker for the graduating class who are about to step into the same world that once felt so hostile to me. The smell of the corridor is exactly the same, a specific alchemy of industrial floor wax, old paper, and the metallic tang of hydronic heating systems that instantly transports me back to my 16-year-old self. But the fear is gone. In its place is a quiet, anthropological curiosity. I walked past the glass display case near the administrative office, the one that used to house the trophies and the honor roll lists. It was strange to realize how small the font was, how insignificant the paper looked behind the smudged glass. 4 years, I had allowed that piece of paper, and the man who controlled it, to occupy the vast majority of my mental real estate. I had built a fortress of excellence to protect myself from a single man's prejudice, constructing a life based on the undeniable power of irrefutable results. But as I stood there in my tailored suit, holding the notes for a speech about resilience and integrity, I realized the final lesson was never about the grade. It was about the cost of the grade. The counterstory here is not that I succeeded despite him. It is that I succeeded in a way that rendered his judgment obsolete. The true victory wasn't on the scoreboard that day, it was in the decades of discipline that followed, a discipline forged in the fire of his doubt. I walked toward the chemistry lab, the scene of the initial crime where he had told me I didn't belong. The door was open. The room was empty, bathed in the amber glow of the late afternoon sun filtering through dust motes that danced in the air like suspended memories. I stepped inside and ran my hand along the black resin of the lab tables. They were pitted and scratched, bearing the marks of thousands of students who had come and gone. I looked at the teacher's desk at the front of the room. It looked smaller now, just a piece of furniture made of cheap laminate and metal. It was no longer a throne of judgment. It was just a desk. I imagined him sitting there, perhaps still bitter, perhaps retired, or perhaps he had forgotten me entirely. And that was the revelation. The anger that had fueled me for so long had evaporated, leaving behind a clear, crystalline understanding of the dynamic. He was never the gatekeeper of my future, he was merely a test of my resolve. He was a stone in the road, not the destination. The black tax, that heavy surcharge of having to be twice as good to get half as far, had been paid in full. I had the receipts. But unlike before, I no longer felt the need to wave them in anyone's face. The receipt was for me. It was proof of purchase for my own dignity. I stood in the center of the room and closed my eyes, listening to the hum of the ventilation, feeling the weight of the history lift off my shoulders. I had spent so much time proving I belonged in this room, on this list, in this institution. But the truth was, this room was too small for who I was becoming. The list was a finite set of data points in an infinite world. I turned around and walked out of the classroom, not looking back at the chalkboard or the teacher's desk. I walked down the hall toward the auditorium where the students were waiting. They needed to hear the truth. Not the story of how to beat a racist teacher at his own game, but the story of how to define oneself independent of the game altogether. The final lesson is that we do not strive for excellence to please our detractors or to shame our enemies. We strive for excellence because it is the only way to honor the potential that was placed inside us. As I pushed open the double doors to the outside world, the sunlight hit me, bright and uncompromising. I smiled, not with the smug satisfaction of a winner, but with the peaceful exhale of a survivor who has finally put down the load. The list didn't matter. The teacher didn't matter. I belonged to myself, and that was the only ranking that would ever count.